You know, usually when we talk about a massive loss of capital in the business world, there's this expectation of like absolute precision.
Right, like an auditor pointing at a ledger.
Exactly. You look at a supply chain breakdown, you see the shipping containers stalled at the port, and the auditor points and says, boom, there it is. That's where we lost the money.
It's very binary. Broken or not broken.
Yeah, profitable or not profitable.
Mm-hmm.
But when you step into the intersection of human neurobiology and workplace performance, that traditional accounting ledger becomes completely useless.
Oh, totally. Because we're trying to quantify the financial impact of human suffering,
Right.
which, really resists being neatly categorized into a spreadsheet.
Right. Which brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're unpacking a highly informative telehealth guide from Coping and Healing Counseling.
Or CHC for short. They're a practice based down in Georgia.
Yeah, and the focus of their guide is Major Depressive Disorder, or MDD. And the hook here, for you listening, the number that stands out immediately in our sources is just staggering.
It really is.
MDD costs U.S. employers an estimated $44 billion annually in lost productivity. $44 billion.
And to even begin to comprehend a number that large, we have to look past the symptom like the financial loss and deconstruct the condition that's actually driving it.
Which means getting into what MDD really is,
Yeah.
and I guess what it isn't.
Exactly. The source material is very intentional about establishing a baseline definition here, primarily by dismantling the myths surrounding depression.
Because there are a lot of them.
So many. I mean, the most pervasive myth is that depression is simply, a state of being profoundly sad.
Like you just had a really bad week.
Right. But the clinical reality detailed in the guide defines major depressive disorder strictly as a neurobiological condition. It's a physiological medical reality involving brain chemistry.
It's not just a temporary emotional state.
No, and it's definitely not a failure of willpower. It involves actual neural pathways.
And the guide mentions a very specific time threshold, right? Like a boundary that separates a temporary mood from an actual clinical diagnosis.
Yes, the 2-week threshold, that's a foundational diagnostic criteria. For a diagnosis of MDD, specific signs must be sustained continuously for at least 2 weeks.
Wow, continuously. So what are those signs?
Well, it involves a persistent low mood, sure. But the symptom profile extends way into the physical realm. The source lists sleep and appetite changes, profound fatigue, and difficulty concentrating.
So it's heavily physical.
Very. It also highlights psychomotor changes.
Wait, what does that actually mean? Psychomotor changes.
It literally means a physical slowing down of a person's physical movements and their speech patterns. Like they physically move slower.
Oh, wow. I don't think most people realize that.
They don't. But the symptom that often represents, the most profound shift in a patient's reality is anhedonia.
Anhedonia. I mean, it sounds so clinical, but the reality of it seems devastating.
It is. Anhedonia is the complete loss of interest or pleasure in activities a person previously enjoyed. The neurobiological reward system in the brain essentially goes offline.
Goes offline, like it just stops working.
Pretty much. A person experiencing anhedonia isn't necessarily crying while trying to engage in their favorite hobby. They simply feel an utter void of the dopamine response that usually makes the activity rewarding.
That's...
The biological mechanism for joy is just suppressed.
To visualize this, for you listening, think of your brain not like a smartphone with a temporary glitch because you opened a buggy app.
I like this analogy.
Right. Like that buggy app is your typical bad day. You close it and the phone works fine. But MDD operates more like a fundamental operating system failure.
Exactly. It's systemic.
The battery drains instantly for no apparent reason, and core systemic functions like sleep mode and focus processing just refuse to run.
Yeah, the physical hardware is sitting right there, seemingly intact, but the software running the machinery is critically compromised.
And when the operating system fails at that level, you can't just instruct the device to hold a charge through sheer force of will. You have to address the compromised software.
Which is exactly why the source emphasizes treating MDD as a medical condition that requires clinical intervention.
I do need to challenge this strict biological definition, though.
Okay, go for it.
If MDD is fundamentally a hardware or systemic software failure, why do outside environmental factors like a toxic workplace or a sudden divorce or a massive financial hit, why do they so often trigger it?
That's a great question.
Doesn't that blur the line between a severe reaction to a bad situation and an actual neurobiological condition?
See, that tension between environment and biology is where the science gets truly fascinating.
Yeah.
An external stressor, like a toxic workplace, isn't just a psychological burden.
Right? It feels physical.
It is physical. It triggers a cascade of physiological responses.
Yeah.
Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol.
The stress hormone.
Exactly. And over time, sustained high levels of cortisol can actually degrade the hippocampus. It alters the function of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. So the environmental stressor literally, physically, alters the neurobiological hardware. A bad day makes you sad. A toxic environment over months can change your brain chemistry.
To the point where it triggers that 2-MIC threshold of an operating system failure.
Precisely.
That distinction makes the current trend of, like, social media self-diagnosis look deeply problematic.
Oh, that's
You know what I
brilliant.
mean? You scroll through your feed and you see a 30-second video claiming, if you are tired today and don't want to go out, you have MDD.
It's everywhere right now.
And the source explicitly warns against this. They insist that diagnosis requires a licensed clinician.
Because an online checklist might capture a momentary mood state or just a perfectly normal reaction to stress, but it cannot differentiate between nuances in neurobiology.
It can't run a diagnostic on your operating system.
Right. A licensed clinician is trained to observe the sustained 2-week period. And more importantly, they're trained to rule out other physiological conditions that mimic MDD.
Like what mimics it?
Things like a severe vitamin D deficiency, an underactive thyroid, or early onset autoimmune issues. They can all present with extreme fatigue and that psychomotor slowing we talked about.
So if you misdiagnose the operating system failure based on a social media post.
You risk applying the wrong intervention entirely, which delays actual evidence-based treatment.
That makes total sense. And when that neurobiological operating system fails, when concentration degrades, energy vanishes, and the psychomotor slowing takes hold, the effects naturally bleed out into the person's environment.
They absolutely do. You can't contain it.
Which brings us directly back to the workplace and that massive $44 billion figure we started with.
Right. If we overlay the clinical symptoms we just unpacked onto the daily demands of a modern job, the math behind that $44 billion becomes alarmingly clear.
Because we aren't just talking about absenteeism, right, where an employee just stays home.
No, absenteeism is easy to track. The far more insidious drain on productivity is presenteeism.
Presenteeism. For those of you listening, this is when the employee is logged in, their status dot is green on the messaging app, and they are sitting upright in the Zoom grid.
But clinically, their cognitive capacity is severely compromised.
Exactly. They're there, but they aren't really there.
You can mask anhedonia in short bursts during a morning meeting, put on a smile for 15 minutes, but you cannot fake sustained cognitive endurance when your neurobiology is actively working against you.
Especially with something like psychomotor slowing.
Right. Consider that symptom combined with impaired concentration. For a knowledge worker, reading a complex spreadsheet or drafting a strategic document requires a high degree of executive function.
And when MDD suppresses that function.
A task that typically requires 45 minutes might take 3 hours.
Wow.
The employee is physically present, but their processing speed is throttled. So you multiply those lost hours by millions of workers across the country, and you arrive at $44 billion.
That is wild. And the guide directs a very specific message to HR leaders and employee assistance programs, which is recognition matters.
It's crucial.
Because the danger here is that traditional performance metrics are blind to neurobiology.
Completely blind.
If a manager doesn't recognize the nuanced clinical signs of MDD, they look at that employee struggling with the spreadsheet and conclude they're just, unmotivated, distracted, or losing their edge.
And what do they usually do?
They try to solve a medical issue by putting the employee on a performance improvement plan, a PIP.
Which is the worst thing you could do. Applying a punitive management tool to a neurobiological condition only increases the individual's stress.
Which increases the cortisol.
Exactly. It increases cortisol and further degrades the brain's functioning. The condition deepens.
So the PIP actually makes the MDD worse.
Yes. The source is warning employers that recognizing the clinical reality is the prerequisite for stopping the financial bleed. You have to route the individual toward medical intervention, not disciplinary action.
Okay, so acknowledging the scale of the problem, the profound personal suffering, and this $44 billion economic void, it demands an examination of the solutions.
We'll have to fix it.
Right. We know what MDD is, and we know the systemic damage it causes. How do we actually treat it? Because the guide is remarkably optimistic here.
It is. It states clearly that MDD is highly treatable.
So what's in the toolkit?
Well, the clinical toolkit is robust and heavily supported by empirical data. The primary interventions detailed in the source include several targeted therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is perhaps the most well-known.
Okay, so how does CBT actually alter the neurobiological state? I mean, we hear that acronym everywhere, but what is the actual mechanism?
Good question. CBT operates on the premise that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interconnected, and that neurobiology can be influenced by conscious cognitive restructuring.
Cognitive restructuring, meaning changing how you think.
Yes, it actively hunts down cognitive distortions. Let's say a patient's brain is running a loop that says, I missed a deadline, therefore I am universally incompetent.
We've all been there.
Right. CBT trains the patient to intercept that faulty logic. They learn to examine the evidence, challenge the automatic thought, and manually reframe the narrative.
And that changes the brain chemistry.
Over time, yes. Actively challenging these negative loops actually strengthens new neural pathways. It essentially rewires the brain's response to stress.
Okay, I understand how changing the thought process works, but I'll admit I struggle with another therapy mentioned in the guide, behavioral activation.
Yeah.
If a core symptom of MDD is anhedonia-like, the total lack of pleasure, motivation, and energy, how do you get someone to initiate an activity in the first place?
It sounds impossible, right?
It feels like telling a car with a completely dead battery to just start driving so the alternator can charge it.
That is the exact paradox behavioral activation addresses. It relies on the concept of acting from the outside in.
Acting from the outside in.
Yeah. The therapy acknowledges that the motivation and joy are biologically offline. They're just not there. So instead of waiting for the feeling of motivation to return before doing an activity.
The patient just does it anyway.
Exactly. The patient schedules and executes small, specific actions despite the lack of feeling. They might schedule a 10-minute walk. The action comes first.
The brain follows.
Slowly, yes. The physical engagement with the environment slowly begins to stimulate those dormant reward pathways in the brain. Repeated action jumpstarts the neurobiology over time.
Wow.
The guide also mentions interpersonal psychotherapy, or IPT, which focuses specifically on improving social functioning and relationship dynamics.
Because our social environment deeply impacts our internal chemistry, like we talked about with the toxic workplace.
Exactly. And the guide points out that these therapies are frequently combined with neurochemical support, specifically mentioning SSRIs and SNRIs.
Medications, right.
Yeah, to understand medications like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRIs, you really have to look at the microscopic level of the brain.
Take us there.
Picture the tiny gap between two neurons, called the synaptic cleft. One neuron releases a neurotransmitter, like serotonin, into this gap to send a signal to the next neuron.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Ordinarily, the first neuron quickly reabsorbs the leftover serotonin to clear the gap. An SSRI blocks that reabsorption process.
So the serotonin stays in the gap.
Yes, it leaves it in the gap longer, amplifying the signal. For a brain experiencing an MDD-related operating system failure, keeping those chemical messengers active longer provides the critical stabilization needed for therapies like CBT to actually take hold.
Ah, so it stabilizes the hardware so you can fix the software.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So we have this incredible evidence-based toolkit. We know how to rewire the thought loops, jumpstart the behaviors, and chemically stabilize the synapses.
We have the tools.
But a toolkit locked inside a vault doesn't help the patient or the economy. And this is where the source material pivots from clinical theory to systemic application.
Right, they use coping and healing counseling as a case study in modern access.
Because having effective treatments is completely irrelevant if the delivery mechanism is fundamentally broken.
And historically, it has been. Access to specialized mental health care has been dictated by geography and socioeconomics.
Yeah, if you look at a state like Georgia, for example, the geographical barriers have traditionally been massive.
Oh, definitely.
If you live in a rural, underserved county far from Atlanta, your local access to a mental health specialist might be practically non-existent. You're looking at a 2-hour drive each way just to sit in a waiting room.
Assuming you can even secure an appointment in the first place.
Right. But CHC's model dismantles that geography entirely. They operate a 100% high-pay compliant telehealth practice serving all 159 counties in Georgia.
It's tearing down the walls.
Literally. A patient in a rural farming community has the exact same access to a clinician through their screen as a patient sitting in a downtown high-rise.
And the guide breaks down the infrastructure supporting that access, which is key. CHC utilizes a diverse, culturally competent team of over 15 licensed therapists.
Which is important, right? Because they aren't just relying on one generalist.
Exactly. They have an entire spectrum of specialists. And the cultural competency element is particularly critical. How symptoms of MDD are expressed and processed is heavily influenced by a patient's cultural background.
So a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work.
It often fails to build the necessary therapeutic alliance. You need someone who understands your context. They provide individual, couples, family, and teen therapy alongside life coaching.
And their clinical scope extends beyond just MDD. The guide lists specialties in anxiety, trauma, PTSD, grief, and relationship issues.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, given your earlier point about environmental stressors triggering neurobiological failures, you rarely treat MDD in a complete vacuum.
You never treat it in a vacuum. But the most profound structural change detailed in the CHC guide, I think, is how they address the logistical and financial bottlenecks.
The waiting lists and the costs.
Right. In traditional mental health care, a patient might realize they need help, only to be told the next available intake appointment is in 3 months.
Which is absurd. When your executive function is degrading and you're battling anhedonia, maintaining the momentum to seek help for 3 months is nearly impossible.
It's a setup for failure. But CHC's model offers same-week intake.
Same week.
That velocity of care is crucial for interrupting the downward trajectory of an MDD episode. Furthermore, they tackle the ultimate barrier, which is cost.
Let's talk about that, because therapy is historically expensive.
Very. But the financial accessibility data in the guide shows they are in-network with major insurers, including Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Healthcare, and Humana.
So what does that look like for the patient's wallet?
Session fees range from $10 to $40 copays for those major insurers.
That's highly approachable. And for individuals on Medicaid, the guide says the copay is $0.
$0. It removes the financial wall entirely for some of the most vulnerable populations.
So let's look at the systemic economics of this for you listening. We have a neurobiological condition that drains $44 billion a year from the economy, largely because people are sitting at their desks unable to biologically perform.
Presenteeism.
Right. And the solution to that massive systemic drain is a telehealth model offering immediate intake and a $10 to $40 copay to deploy proven clinical treatments.
The return on investment is just. It's astronomical, simply by reconnecting the patient with effective care.
It really is. And the guide notes that this system is easily accessible right now for anyone in Georgia. CHC can be reached at 404-832-0102, online at cheektherapy.com, or via email at support@cheektherapy.com.
By combining statewide telehealth, broad insurance acceptance, and immediate intake, you transform evidence-based treatments from, theoretical concepts in a medical journal into deployable, scalable solutions.
Well, we've mapped out a really complex landscape today. We started by discarding the cultural myth of simple sadness to examine the neurobiological reality of major depressive disorder.
A condition defined by sustained systemic failures, like severe psychomotor slowing and that profound loss of joy known as anhedonia.
And then we traced how those invisible physical symptoms ripple outward into the workplace, creating that phenomenon of presenteeism that drives a $44 billion economic loss.
A massive loss.
Finally, we looked at how modern telehealth structures, like those utilized by CHC, are dismantling the geographical and financial walls that have historically kept patients separated from life-saving, evidence-based treatments.
Which is the most hopeful part of this whole guide.
Absolutely. So whether you're an HR leader analyzing productivity metrics, or you're trying to support a colleague, or even navigating your own neurobiology, looking past the myths to see the clinical reality is the necessary first step.
We spent a lot of time analyzing the intersection of business impacts and telehealth efficiency today. And I want to leave everyone with this dynamic to consider moving forward.
Lay it on us.
If untreated MDD is a $44 billion invisible drain on productivity, and a fully realized telehealth model with minimal copays makes clinical intervention instantly accessible.
Yeah.
Will we soon reach a point where providing immediate, frictionless access to a telehealth therapist is no longer classified as a corporate healthcare perk, but rather demanded as essential basic infrastructure for any functioning business, just like providing a laptop or a Wi-Fi connection?
Now that is a provocative thought, something for all of us to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. See you next time.